we're going to do somewhat of an in-depth look at Osiris and his origins, and then the beliefs that are wrapped around them in Egypt and through to the Greek times. Now, Osiris was Osiris in Coptic. It's the god of the afterlife and the underworld. Now, he's related to a few things. He's related to Sirius and the star Sirius and the North Star, the unseen star, and people say that could be the North Star they're relating to and things, but of course it was a very definitely seen star. But you go much farther south in Egypt and it becomes an unseen star, so perhaps there is some connection there. People try to make one. There's another one that during the day the sun's out and you don't see any of the stars or the moon, and then at nighttime you see the moon and all the stars. And so he was the god of night, or the underworld, or where things like that happened. And the sun goes through the underworld and the underside of the earth and then comes back up the other side, and the sun comes across the sky in a 12-hour procession, or the 12 steps of Horus. The 12 steps of Horus are the 12 hours in the day, and Nun, or noon, is straight up whenever God's at his most high. Now, you have a symbology there with, in the Bible, most things happening at the noon hour and when God is at his most high. He's classically depicted as a green-skinned deity, but he's not a Martian, along with a pharaoh's beard, partially mummy-wrapped at the legs, wearing a distinctive Atef crown. And a lot of depictions show him chest down, wrapped as a mummy, but then back alive on top, and so it shows you this rebirth that he has connected with him and the afterlife and the underworld. Now, he's connected with Pluto, and the ancient Greek god of the underworld, where whenever you die you get to go to Elyssian Fields. And of course Elyssian would be Elis, and El is the god of the Levant. And so this shows you the connection there that you have with this whole area that we have, and Aryans, and the people that brought grain and things to this area of Egypt. And when you look at the symbology here, just in this staff that he contains, it's a shepherd's crook, and then he has a flail. Now, this is symbology of shepherding, right? And shepherding is definitely a symbology of people who have become animalistic and no longer hunter-gatherers, and have become farmers, and farmers of livestock. And the flail is like to keep flies or bad things away. This is a keeping people together, a shepherding. This is a swatting away of the bad. And, so he's a keeper of the duality of things, the duat. And so he's wearing a distinctive Atef crown. This is like the Upper Egypt crown, and it's got a point, and people have said, oh, he's covering up a cone head. Well, not unless he looked just like the cone heads, and I'd show you a picture of those, but that's straight up cone. The people we see with the elongated heads comes far back. It's a big swabbing going back, not going up. They'd go up to a point that would lead back here, not to straight up. But still, regardless of that, he's holding the crook and flail. Osiris was sometimes considered the eldest son of Geb. Now, Geb is the god of the earth. Highlight and give some insight here. Geb was the Egyptian god of the earth and the later member of the Ennead of Peloponnesus. He had a viper around his head and was thus also considered the father of snakes. Was believed in ancient Egypt. Geb's laughter created earthquakes. that he allowed crops to grow. Now, this is the story of Pluto. Pluto was the god that would create thunder and rumblings under the earth, and he had a pitchfork or a trident that allowed him to do so. It had his powers in it, and you also, if you look at Neptune, the original lord of the earth, Enki, or Ea, right? Ea, of the Sumerians, was relegated to being the god of the waters. And this turned into a Neptune idea, and then the Phoenician stories of Sidon and Poseidon get pulled together into one concept, but later, to have people have similar things. Hey, we've got that. Hey, you've got that. But before, whenever they didn't have that, but one people had that. Now, ancient Neptune also with his trident, and Pluto is seen with a trident, that he would strike the ground with this and create earthquakes. And it showed you that he was the god of the world. This is all the ancient symbology that they had with it. It wasn't somebody else. You would hear a rumbling or lightning. Now that's going to go to Zeus and all these type of things. And so it's, which god are you worshiping, if you will. So he's the son of Geb, which would have been the earth and its primordial rumbling, and then the sky goddess Nut. Now Nut's usually shown, she's shown here, she's one of the pale goddesses. She's Isis's sister pretty much, and or mother, I'm sorry, and also part half sister due to something else, but we won't go there. She's known as the sky, and whenever they show her in the symbology, she's draped over the earth and has stars emblazoned all over her nude body, and so she is like the sky goddess. She is basically the Milky Way, if you will, Nut. And then, as well as being brother and husband to Isis, Horus being considered his posthumous begotten son. And this is a strange story where after he was killed and cut apart to pieces, that he was actually put back together, but the only place they couldn't find, or the only piece they couldn't find, was his phallus. And she fashioned one, in one story, she fashioned one out of gold, and she rode that and become pregnant. Now, this oddly echoes the story of ancient Babylon, or ancient Sumeria, actually, back in the elder days, whenever the wife of Nimrod, who was Semiramis, who was pregnant with his son whenever he was killed, and then yet and had no heir, yet she did and raised him on, said that he had come from the sun rays. Anyhow, let's look at this more. I can't seem to get a paragraph in without giving too much descriptions. As well as being the husband of Isis, with Horus being considered his posthumously begotten son, or after the fact. It was also associated with the epithet Kinti Amintu, meaning the foremost of the Westerners. Reference to the kingship of the land of the dead, and everything goes to the west. The sun sets in the west. Every day the sun dies and it gets reborn. It goes around through the earth like people do, and then there's this symbology of being reborn, right? And with the symbology of being reborn, you have this concept that there is a dusk, right? And dusk is known as sunset, and it's known as set for a reason. We'll get into that because that's one of his siblings also. As a ruler of the dead, Osiris was also sometimes called King of the Living, because eventually everybody goes there. Eventually all the living do go to there. In fact, there are ancient stories that tell you that the king of the living, of the true living people, the true living God, was jealous because the god of death got to get everybody. And while at first there were more people on the earth than dead, later there became much more people that were in the land of the dead than there were in the land of the living, and he became jealous of such facts, and then there were fights between such and things. I'll definitely do a video about that, and it talks about how Seth and Osiris have an ancient fight and things like that, so it's pretty pretty odd story, but we'll get into that in a different video. Now, the ancient Egyptians considered the blessed dead to be the living ones, or they were immortal. Indeed, they're immortalized, and we're still talking about them today, right? So, through synchronism, or a stretching of a web, like I've told you about how different connections there are easily, through synchronism, he's connected with Ea. Well, Ea is Enki. He's the primordial god of the earth that was turned into Neptune with the trident, right? The second triad that he has, right? Now, this also, oddly, Ea is known as the god of the ocean, and we know how the moon affects the tides and affects the waters, and they realize this fact. So he's also the god of the moon. And when you look at Ea, right, I'll show you something conspicuous here. Ea is a lunar deity in ancient Egyptian religion. Ea is the word, it simply means the moon. In fact, there's no J before the 1300s, but it's depicted as being Ja or Ya, right? Ja or Ea or Ea, as in Ea, or how you would pronounce the primordial name of Enki, who was Lord of the earth, or Lord of all living people, or all living creatures. And so, as in Yah, as in Yahweh, or as in Jah, as in Jehovah, right? Jo, Ea. Let's continue. Osiris was considered the brother of Isis, Set, Nephthys, and Horus the Elder, and the father of Horus the Younger. Now this again echoes the Sumerian tale, where Semiramis had a child that was the same, and so he would have been Nimrod II, if you will, or the first junior. Here we have Horus being reborn. Now they believed in elder times that the sun and the moon, of course, are the same size pretty much. You can tell that during an eclipse. But we used to have two suns. This is echoed all the way through concepts like even in Star Wars, you know, whenever they have the place that he comes from in Tatooine where it's two suns. And one of these suns had died off, right? Whereas the other sun was still living. One sun killed another one during an eclipse. He blocked it out and burned it, you know, and so here we have like the story of the Bible that contains Cain and Abel, and then Seth is the new kid that comes from Adam and Eve after this fact, whenever Cain slew Abel and was banished to the land of Nod, where he took a wife, where, funny, there's women already there in this land that aren't described, but we're not going to go there today. Anyhow, the first evidence of the worship of Osiris was found in the middle of the 5th dynasty of Egypt, although it's likely he was worshipped much earlier, and people see, you know, things that show you that. The Kinti Amintu epithet dates to at least the 1st dynasty, so the same epithet used for him, or Pluto in that effect, is him. And, you know, in Egyptian stuff, you would go to an Elyssian field where there was, you know, no more things, and they had already killed off symbolically all the crocodiles, you know, all the problems that would be, you know, the Leviathan of your Bible was not there, and there was not going to be any problems. There weren't going to be problems from the people around them, none of the Nahasu, none of the Nubians, any of the people that gave them any problem. It was going to be their, you know, their special place that they were going to go to in the Elyssian Fields. So, it's also used as a pharaonic title, right? And so you can show that there's connection going back to this concept of the pharaonic title going to this concept that predates pretty much Egypt itself, or being into the first dynasties of being a unified kingdom. Indeed, he's only wearing the upper crown. So most information available on the myths of Osiris are derived from allusions contained in the pyramid text at the end of the 5th dynasty. Later New Kingdom source documents such as the Shabaka stone, which I've done one on, and I really need to update it with a couple of things I've learned, and the contending of Horus and Seth I spoke of earlier, and much later in narrative styles from writings in Greek authors, including Plutarch and Diodorus Siculus. And of course, the names in Greeks have a lot of times to go with them, and Pluto and Plutarch, right? And of course, Plato, and the stories that come out of that. Anyhow, Osiris was the judge of the dead and the underworld agency that granted all life, including sprouting vegetation and the fertile flooding of the Nile River Valley. He was described as he who is permanently benign and youthful, yet he was a dead god. This again echoes the Sumerian tale where they tell you that Kingu was killed, his face turning pale, always faced upon Ki, which is earth, and therefore he was the man in the moon, and the moon doesn't spin, it constantly faces us. A lot of people don't make that connection, but his name was Kingu, and they said that they had slayed him and used his blood in the clay that made all of men, right? From the time before when he was alive. And so there was 2 sons again here off of it, because Kingu was the son of a consort, right? But then he was kind of like a pseudo consort, or a bodyguard, if you will, to Ki herself. And of course, Ki gets into a fight, or gets run into and spilt water, or a glass of water on, imparting water or flood concept onto Ki from Tiamat. This is the striking of the ancient planets and the concept with it. Got a video on it. I don't want to blur this one with that concept, but anyhow, the sprouting of vegetation, the fertile land, including the Nile River, he was described as being he who permanently benign and youthful, the Lord of Silence. The king of Egypt were associated with Osiris in death, symbolizing they would make this same journey somehow. And as Osiris rose from the dead, so would they union with him and inherit eternal life through a process of imitative magic. By the new kingdom of all people, not just pharaohs, were believed to be associated with Osiris at death. So instead of it just being pharaohs, it became all of people. So instead of just the presidents, then all people were ended up being embalmed and done in this way, and allowed to go, come in and share in the rights. If they incurred the cost of the assimilation rituals, in other words, if they could pay for their way through life, so they could pay the ferryman. All right. Now, through the hope of new life after death, Osiris began to be associated with the cycles observed in nature, in particular vegetation of the annual flooding of the Nile, though his links with the heliacal rising of Orion and Sirius at the start of the new year. Now, again, here we have the O and A transposition of Greeks versus other people around them. And you have the rising of Orion, which would have been Arian, and Sirius, which would be Osiris, okay, at the start of each new year. Now, Osiris was widely worshipped until the decline of ancient Egyptian religion during the rise of Christianity into the Roman Empire, where things took on a different idea, but I think we might have already just seen a hint of how that kind of twist and come about. Now, Osiris in Latin transliterature of the ancient Greek is Osiris, right here. O, that's the L, ancient S. I, the P is the R. I-S or U-S, right? Cyrus the Great, Cyrus, us. So, Osiris, which in turn is the Greek adaptation of the original name in the Egyptian language. In Egyptian hieroglyphs, the name appears as Wajir, right? Wajirus, all right? So they get Osiris out of that, Y or Au out of it, which some Egyptologists instead choose to translate as Osager or Jasiger, right? Since hieroglyphic writing lacks vowels, just like ancient Hebrew and a lot of ancient scripts, Egyptologists have vocalized the name in various ways, and it really comes about as Asar, Yasar, Asur, Asaru, putting a U on the end to deify it, Asar, Asir, Hasar, Usair, Usair, and Aser. All this is very clear to be austere or a star. Then again, there are people that kind of thought of the sun as being our star that was close to us, and the moon being the same size, but the dead was the original star, and now we have a new one. And the other one comes at night. Night is the time of death, and then day is life and death, and it's a cycle. It is the yin and yang of bright day and dark night, and the duality of the two concepts, right? Several proposals have been made for etymology of the meaning of the name. If you want to, you can look at these right here, but it seems like it's mighty one, right? And powerful God, right? The seat of the eye of the man in the moon, right? It's also the product of something being made. And indeed, they knew that the moon cycles controlled plants and crops. To this day, the almanac that we use, it tells you to plant after certain moons. After the third moon of the new year, you do this, you do that. And after the fourth moon, you can plant certain things and run through, so they run the crops correctly with them. And it's things that go back to actually ancient Celtic knowledge and ancient farming knowledge that people really don't see evident in these people till you see the rites of spring and the concepts that they go with them. Now, Osiris is represented in the most developed form of iconography, wearing the Atef crown, as you see, which is over here, and but it doesn't have the secondary crown, and it shows two ostrich feathers that are curled, so it's a kind of different showing here. He carries a crook and flail. The crook is thought to represent Osiris as a shepherd god. The symbolism of the flail is more uncertain, as the shepherd's whip or fly whisk association with the god Enjeti, or the ninth nome of Lower Egypt, is proposed. And there are different eras. People think Egypt was all one thing, but just like the Greek pantheon spawned out of an ancient thought into a more modern thought into a 12 god pantheon, so did a lot of other peoples, and it tied in together with zodiacs and things like that, and became quite a different view than you pretty much would get out of a lot of things. So you can look at things like the pyramid text describe an early concept of an afterlife in terms of eternal traveling with the sun god amongst the stars, that once people died, that they would end up traveling with the sun god, and you would see them at night in the time of death, and they would travel with the stars. You could become a star. But here's another connection with the Sumerian god here, written out in this plainly. Amongst these mortuary texts at the beginning of the 4th dynasty is found An, who is the god of heaven of the Sumerians, offering the king gifts, and Anubis. Now, Anu or An is that same god, and Bis, who is actually a man in action, doing something. And indeed, the jackal god Anubis is thought to have done a lot of things, and he is conniving, he is thinking of things. And a lot of people look at phonetics and look in ancient linguistics, believe that Bis has something to do with biz and busy, and has to do with business. So, by the end of the 5th dynasty, the formula in all tombs becomes An offering the king gives, and Osiris. So you can see the god of the dead kind of transposes, but there are yet depictions that show both of them. So it's kind of a concept. And then there's the concept of like Hades, right, versus the concept of like Pluto. And so again, you get a duality. You get a duality of night and day, and then each one of those gets a duality, and it keeps going. In fact, a lot of these religions are based on a duality. There's a yin and yang to every concept, and when there's a God that does this, there's a God that does that. Now, a God that's a rain God can either withhold rain from you and become a God of drought, or give you plenty, or he can flood the world, you see. So he can also cause lightning bolts and can become Zeus, and you can turn around and try to put a blanket over that too under one concept, but wouldn't necessarily be evident to the people that had totally different beliefs. And you can see the same concept come out of the exact same happening from two different people that started from different beliefs. Anyhow, Osiris is the mythical father of the god Horus, whose conception is described in the Osiris myth I spoke of before, where she had to find his penis or remake it again, and in doing so was able to father him, which echoes again, like the Moses myth, which is also found off in Sargon, where he was put into a basket and he was supposed to be led through Egypt, which is this here. It kind of puts a strange twist on all that. The myth describes Osiris as being killed by his brother Set, who wanted Osiris' throne, sun Set, so he dies at sunset, who wanted Osiris' throne. His wife Isis finds the body of Osiris and hides it in the reeds, where it is found and dismembered again by Set. Now, that's just one telling of it. Isis retrieves and joins the fragmented pieces back together of Osiris, and briefly begins Osiris back to life by the use of magic. The spell gives her time to become pregnant again by Osiris before he again dies. Isis later gives birth to Horus. As such, since Horus was born after Osiris' resurrection, Horus became thought of as a representative of new beginnings and the vanquisher of the usurper Set. So it's like, aha, can't kill me. And again, this echoes a Babylonian Sumerian ancient tale. Ta Seker, who resulted from the identification of the creator god Ptah with Seker, thus gradually became identified with Osiris, and the two becoming Ptah Seker Osiris, as the sun was thought to spend the night in the underworld and subsequently reborn every morning. Now, Ta Seker Osiris was identified as a king of the underworld, god of the afterlife and death and regeneration. Oddly, here you can think of things symbolically. There are people that worship the dawn, right? And there are people that worship sunsets and the beauty of sunsets. And you could say somebody that was worshiping the dawn was looking for things to come, and a young man striving. And people that were worshiping sunsets were elder people watching time pass in a lifetime that is already going downhill, right? Or leaning to the west as you become old. Anyhow, the ram god, Osiris' soul, or rather his Ba, was occasionally worshipped in its own right and as if it was a distinctive god. Well, Ba is not really... it's more, Ba is more like power or key, or it's your what causes you to have a reputation or being, it's your, like you hear about Bruce Lee, okay, and then there Bruce Lee's Ba is all that's behind that guy, anyhow. Anyhow, he's a distinct god, especially in the delta and city of Mendes. This aspect of Osiris was referred to as Banebjedet, which is grammatically feminine, with the et on the end of it. Also spelled Banebjed or Banebjed, and this Jed has a serpent attached to it. Literally the Ba of the Lord of the Jed, which roughly means the soul of the Lord and the pillar of continuity. And I don't know if you can see him well in here, but you can see that this is Jed, and that's a symbol for land, right? And then these right here are pillars, and those are known as Jed pillars, and they're in a few of the depictions, yet we've never even found one of these that has this top with this rings around them and this effect. It almost looks strangely like some type of layered battery type effect or something. People make up a lot of stories about it. But the Nile supplying water, the Jed, or a type of pillar, was usually understood as the backbone of Osiris. And again, Jed is attached to being a serpent, right? So this has attachment to that. The Nile supplying water and Osiris strongly connected to the vegetable regeneration, who died only to be resurrected, like you would see in plants, like you see in a vine that dies off during the winter but then comes right back. Trees lose all their leaves, but then they come back. They're not an evergreen style of tree. Certain ones were. Those were worshipped by certain people, the cedars and things like that. So, this represented continuity and stability, I guess, in the role of light, in the circle of life. All right. And as Bene-Jed, Osiris was given the epithets such as Lord of the Sky and Lord of the Sun, or Sun God Ra. Now, since Ra, when he became identified with Atum, was considered Osiris's ancestor, right? And then Atum, of course, can be seen as the autumn, or the fall, or each year as it makes its trek down southward 1 degree per day, reaching its lowest point, would sit still for 3 days and then rise back up to save all of mankind, near a constellation known as the Southern Cross. And so you see that depicted. Now, since Ba is associated with his power, and it's also happened to be the word for ram, or Aries in Egyptians, and of course the time of Aries was a time of war. Bene-Jed was depicted as a ram, or a ram-headed. A living sacred ram was kept at Mendes and worshipped as the incarnation of the god, much like you would see an Apis bull, right? And upon death, the rams were mummified and buried in a ram-specific necropolis that they had in the area. Bene-Jed was constantly said to be Horus's father, and as Bene-Jed was an aspect of Osiris. Regarding to the now, so you can see people blending in certain people, but then they're putting that all together as one, and then attaching it to sky and the way things ran with the world. Some of these being people, and they associate with them. The god's traditional crook and flail are the instruments of the shepherd, which is suggested to some scholars to be an origin for Osiris and herding tribes of the Upper Nile that had recently gotten their cattle, their goats, their everything from the Levant and up through into Samaria, where the cattle had actually come from. Horses not yet, but about to come there when the Hyksos finally come in. The crook and flail were originally symbols of the minor agricultural deity Enjeti and passed to Osiris later. From Osiris, they eventually passed to Egyptian kings, and generally as symbols of divine authority, that the kings had authority over the land and how it would grow things. And of course, the kings and their priests would be able to tell you when to plant things, and they would tell you what's going to happen and when the Nile's going to flood, because they had known and been studying it for years, and they kind of knew when all this was going to happen. And of course, studying the tides of the ocean and how they would rise and fall. In one version of the myth, Isis used to spell a brief revive on Osiris so he could impregnate her after embalming and burying Osiris. Isis is conceived to give birth to her son, which is Horus the Younger. Thereafter, Osiris lived on as the god of the underworld. Because of his death and resurrection, Osiris was associated with flooding and retreating of the Nile, thus with the yearly growth and death of crops along the Valley Nile. One ancient description of this said that he had died in the Nile, and so he got associated with the god Happy, but then also how he had died in the Nile would attach in this way that we had just spoke of. Greek scholar Diodorus Siculus gives another version of the myth in which Osiris was described as an ancient king who taught the Egyptians the arts of civilization, like Thoth had done, or taught us the Phoenician, including agriculture, then traveled the world with his sister Isis. The satyrs which would have been Levant or Saturn worshippers, Satyr, the reason we have Saturn and Saturday, and the 9 muses before before returning to Egypt. Osiris was then murdered by his evil brother Typhon, who is identified with Set. Now, Typhon is a red-haired god, said to be red-haired and had blue eyes. It's his brother. And here's a picture of him you can see in there, where he definitely has red hair. And this is Zeus right here. And you can see Zeus carrying that thunderbolt, which is very much like thunderbolts that you see in Ninurta. And everybody has that exact same symbol of a lightning or a thunderbolt passed around to everybody. But definitely a red-haired god. He looks somewhat elfin. The bottom half of his body are 2 different types of snakes. I'm going to do one on Typhon. I believe I already have it set in there. I just have to release it and finish off the editing. So, Typhon was identified with Set. Typhon divided his body into 26 pieces, which he distributed amongst his fellow conspirators in order to implicate them in the murder. Isis and Hercules, Horus, avenged the death of Osiris and slew Typhon, which, Typhoon, or the sea god. Isis referred to all the parts of Osiris's body except for the phallus, which was thrown into the sea, and secretly buried them. Now, an odd connection there, too, is that Uranus, back in the day, had supposedly been castrated, and they threw his junk into the sea, and then out of the sea became many of the creatures, then the Kraken, and yet Persephone comes out of there, and goddesses and stuff, too. Famously standing in a seashell. Anyhow, so, and that's a strange twist, too. I've got a whole story on that. We won't go there today. Isis recovered all the body parts of Osiris's body except the phallus and secretly buried them. She made replicas of them and distributed them in several locations, which then became centers of Osiris worship. And indeed, a lot of old places, they would have hands of special people and everything. I remember one of the Dungeon Dragon things they had was Hand of Vecna, and it was a mummified hand of an ancient lich that whenever you held onto his hand and used your powers, you got enhancement just because you were holding onto his hand because he had so much power, even though he was dead. So anyhow, odd things though here. You can see this picture here of Osiris and how they water him, and he grows up reeds, or he grows up wheat. And it's from bas reliefs and everything here. Right? So, annual ceremonies were performed in honor of Osiris in various places across Egypt. This was whenever you would start to see Orion coming up in the sky, and then you would see the northern star, or Sirius, start to rise on the horizon, and that's whenever they knew, hey, a full moon coming around there, and we ought to be right about the end of, winter, or wherever it is in the mountains and so on. It's going to cause an excess of floods that happen here and at this time, and so they kind of knew it, and they would herald it in. It's almost like the rites of spring. These ceremonies were fertility rites which symbolized the resurrection of Osiris. Now, Wallace E. Budge stated Osiris was closely connected with the germination of wheat. The grain which was put into the ground is the dead Osiris, and the grain which had germinated Osiris would once again renewed to life. And indeed, that's part of the ceremony where they would plant some seeds and water them, and then a few days later they'd start popping up, and they would see the rebirth of life from what looked like a little dead seed all the way into, and it's almost like the mustard seed parable, where there's a little seed, looks like a dead little thingy, and it can grow this giant tree out of it. So from something that you thought was a dead little nothing, now we have an entire religion built out of it. Anyhow, Plutarch and others noted that sacrifices to Osiris were gloomy, solemn, and mournful, that there was a sad state, and this again echoes Sumerian tales of Dumuzi, where Dumuzi had died, and this was the rites of spring and then coming back, and how the mourning of that would cause all of winter, but then she was allowed to reunite with him, and this caused the beauty of spring that rode through summer. Then during the fall of man, or autumn, he would go back to the underworld, and this caused the death of winter, which came back into spring. And spring is Easter, right? And that, of course, contains Ea, and Stir, which is Saturn's name from Ur of the Chaldees. And these are the rites of whenever there's more dark than light through the wintertime because of the sun's position. But right at the point of Easter is whenever the amount of sunlight takes over the amount of night, and now the sun god takes over through the summer. And again at fall, or autumn, you have it to where it pinches off and becomes more night than day again, riding through winter and coming around. Now, during that time, women would throw dirt over their head and act like they're almost burying themselves. They would cut off their hair for Dumuzi, and indeed there's stories in the Bible about Tammuz, which is the same entity, even talking about it being in the temple. But celebrated by two phrases here. Began at Abdos, commemorating the death of the god on the same day the grain was planted on the ground. The annual festival involved the construction of the Osiris beds, formed in the shape of Osiris, filled with soil and sown with seeds. They would take and water these things, and then a few days later they would start sprouting up. Everybody would show theirs off at the end of the symbol. It's possible that they would use these and graft them as startings of new plots and new places that they were going to farm, and all they had to do is till the soil then and induct these things that everybody had made into there, and they would symbolically plant the whole area. There's a few little things that kind of attest to that, but let's go on. The germinating seeds symbolize Osiris rising from the dead, an almost pristine example of what's found in the tomb of Tutankhamun by Howard Carter. The first phase of the festival was a public drama depicting the murder and dismemberment of Osiris, the search of his body by Isis, the triumphant return and resurrected God, and the battle in which Horus defeated Set. The sun set, and so he rose again. According to Julius Firmicus Maternus in the 4th century, this play was reenacted each year by worshippers who beat their breasts and gnashed their shoulders. This is, of course, like people flailing themselves and wailing at the Wailing Wall. Anyhow, when they pretend that the mutilated remains of the god have been found and rejoined, they turn from mourning to rejoicing. The passion of Osiris was reflected in the name Wennefer, and which is the one who continues to be perfect, which also alludes to his post-mortem power. So in other words, even though he's dead, or even though the moon is dead, it still has power over the earth, causes the tides, lots of changes and things. The moon is thought to have powers over people. Lunacy is the idea that the moon can drive you crazy. Lycanthropy and ideas of werewolves are all based around this. There's a lot of ancient thought lines that go with this. Part of the myth recounting the chopping of the body into 14 pieces by Set is not recounted in this particular stela, though, although it's attested to be part of the rituals by the version of the papyrus in Humalak, in which it says it took 12 days to reassemble the pieces, so here's your 12 pieces, coinciding with the festival of plowing, and this is the plowing and starting of the fields I spoke of. Some elements of the ceremony were held in the temple, while others involved public participation in the form of theater. The stele of I Care Nefert recounts the program of events and public elements over the 5 days of the festival. They say the first day, the procession of Wepwawet, is a mock battle enacting during which the enemies of Osiris are defeated. The procession was led by the god Wepwet, or the opener of the way. Now, this is Osiris being defeated, though, all right? And so the second day, the body of Osiris is taken to his temple, and the boat that he's transported in, the Neshmet bark, had to be defended against his enemies. That was on the first day after his death. On the third day, which is the second day after his death, Osiris is mourned and the enemies of the land are destroyed, right? On the fourth day, which would have been the third day, prayers and recitations are made and the funeral rites are performed. And on the fifth day, Osiris rises again and reborn at dawn and crowned with the crown of Maat. A statue of Osiris is brought into the temple. And indeed, at the same time, the Sumerians had this deal where the statue of Tammuz would be brought outside, dressed in regagla, like he was back alive,